Welcome to the Director's Seminar at the Institute for Global Prosperity. I'm Henrietta L, and I am the founder and director of the IGP. Lovely to have you all with us this evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Pablo Munoz, who is joining us from Durham University this evening to give the seminar today. We would have welcomed him in person, and he would have preferred to have been here in person, but the trains are not cooperating. So you will have to ask your questions and send your questions to him online. The title of his talk is Recalibrating Entrepreneurship, Myths, Facts, Fads, and the Need to Embrace the Pluralism of Entrepreneurial Activity. Now, Professor Munoz is Professor of Entrepreneurship and Director of the PhD program at the Durham University Business School. His research focuses on prosocial entrepreneurship and its research impact. His focus is on engaged scholarship, and he explores two themes, I think: how individuals use entrepreneurial practices to overcome challenging circumstances and create a more sustainable future. And second, how to advance the idea of impact in process to bring research impact into the core of social science research. Professor Munoz currently serves as the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Business Venturing Insights and is published very widely in a number of other high impact journals. So could you join me in welcoming him to the IGP this evening, please? So Pablo, I'm going to give you the floor now, yes?
Oh, thank you very much. And thank you, well, obviously for the invitation. I would have loved to be there. Well, I suppose next time. I've been a fan of the institute for a while, and I think you're doing an amazing job. So it's great to be here. So this is part of an ongoing concern, if you like, on where we're going with entrepreneurship research and our understanding of entrepreneurship practice and what it contributes to. So I believe, and well, not just me, sort of many colleagues, that there is currently a misleading view of what entrepreneurship actually is, and that's creating several fairly unrealistic expectations, right, around what entrepreneurship can do, and not just for the individuals, but society more broadly, right? So I'm one of many who are trying to call to change our view of research and practice and try and embrace the diversity of entrepreneurial activity in not just in terms of the kinds and types, but also in where, how can it occur, and perhaps just come and look at the alternative futures that might be out there, and then try and explore what are those hidden costs. And that's been my passion, at least when it comes to that side of my research agenda, trying to figure out what is behind entrepreneurship, right? So if it's not the idea we've constructed, what else is in there, right? So we know entrepreneurship is difficult, right? So if we have entrepreneurs in the room, I've done it myself, and I work with entrepreneurs all the time, and we all can agree that it's a very challenging thing to do, but nonetheless people embark in that process day in, day out, right? And the question is, why so many engage in that activity, knowing that it's so challenging, right? And I believe that we still have in our collective imaginary a slightly different idea of what entrepreneurship is, and that's the misleading view, I think, that still prevails, right? So if you do that sort of a very simple exercise, right, you go Google what entrepreneurship is, and then you go to images, right? Because images, I think, is very powerful because it's essentially people tagging, right? So this is to me, it's a representation of entrepreneurship, right? So you see things like it's about passion, it's sexy, it's cool. It involves a lot of things, right? But I'm ultimately This is me, an expression of myself, right? And things like self-determination and autonomy, achievement, and all sort of adjectives you see attached to normally to an individual, right? So we don't talk about the process, we don't talk about, say, new business creation and the stages that one should follow, but we talk about an individual, right? A hero, and we've built that image, right, of what an entrepreneur is around that person who is clearly different from the rest of us. And I always wonder how we came to develop that idea. And I love, well, George Monbiot, he's an ecologist and is a columnist for The Guardian. And he has we have a few TED Talks, and I really like this one. He talks about political narratives, right? And he says that the narratives that we have is what we use to navigate the world. And we've been building like narratives for ourselves, like for millennia, right? So is what's behind religion, is what behind Harry Potter, all the good plots, right, that we love and enjoy. They all have the similar narrative where there's something wrong in the world, right? And there are powerful forces that are affecting the way and threatening our society, right? State of being. But then there's a hero, right, that revolves right against the disorder, and they will go and restore harmony in the land. That's George Monbiot's story, right? So, and he goes and takes us through a few of those stories, right? So takes us to the Great Depression and how Keynesian economics went and repair with a new narrative, right, where the enabling state will, with the support of the working class, will bring harmony back to the land. And then back in the 1780s, there was a new restoration story, right? But in this case, it was the state was that powerful force. And interestingly, the new hero that emerged, right, to counteract the problems that we're seeing is the entrepreneur, right? And the entrepreneur will roll the state, will create wealth and opportunity, and then we'll go and restore the land. And the beauty of restoration story is that they're very appealing, right? And you see left and right supporting, and now in this case, entrepreneurship, right? So I'm Chilean, born and raised in Chile, and in the last election, we have the two extremes, so an almost like communists and then an extreme right candidate, and both of them talking about entrepreneurship in a very positive way. So it's very paradoxical how an idea can sit equally comfortably in both sides of the political spectrum, right? And that's it. So we build that idea of the entrepreneur as a hero today. And I always say I have a job, and a beautiful job, because entrepreneurship is so predominant now in society, so valuable that I managed to make a professor out of a career in entrepreneurship research. So, and then there's the premise, right, that we should support entrepreneurship because they can create growth, they can add to national income, and in some cases they can create change in community development, emancipation, and so many things we love and enjoy, because ultimately the entrepreneur is the modern hero, and is rolling back the stakes and creating value, right, and it is bringing harmony back to society, right, and that's how we tend to see. The problem with that is that the underlying assumption is that entrepreneurship it follows a normal distribution, right? That the normality exists in the middle, right? And the images we've built, so that hero, it can be applied to the normality, right? So the normal population. When in reality, entrepreneurship, it follows is a power law distribution, right? Is a skew distribution where just a fraction, a minority of the cases explain most of the outcome. That means that just a fraction of entrepreneurs, right, explaining most of the employment, about most of the economic output, right? So every single measure you use across sectors is just a fraction of individuals who explain most of the outcome. So the question is, well, what happens with the rest, right? The very, very long tail of entrepreneurial endeavors that they're contributing to society, but in a slightly different way. So we've been obsessed with that sort of pinnacle, and under the assumption that that's a norm, right? And then the fuss, right? And then we have this crazy idea, mythical animals, right? The unicorns, the gazelles, and so on. And those are the outliers, right? That tend to create most of the value. Although we know that there's a lot of there are a lot of problems behind unicorns, right? Because they're based solely on market valuation. But nonetheless, we end up in a situation where we've been chasing unicorns, right? And we talk about unicorns, and we get very excited about the idea of having £1 billion startup, because there's an assumption that they will create something else, right? And therefore, as a result of it, because that's exciting, we end up disregarding the other boring reality, right? The shops and so on. So there are great entrepreneurs who have many abilities that can create change in society. They can create growth and so on. And the question is, well, where are they? Who are they, right? So what? And because if we can manage to identify those, we have an idea of, well, of that image, right, of what entrepreneur is. But if you have a sort of, if you ask around, right, who are those entrepreneurs, the images that come to mind is the Steve Jobs and the Richard Bransons and the Elon Musks of the world, right? So, and because that's the sort of the idea of that hero. This is obviously, I'm very picky on the kind of information I picked, right? That I decided to include here. Clearly, they're much more than just what I'm describing. But I guess it's a good representation of what's behind that idea, right? So when behind Steve Jobs, we find a very troubled individual with a lot of narcissistic disorders and obsessive compulsive behavior. And then behind Elon Musk, we have someone promoting like 100-hour work week, right? Which is clearly unsustainable. And then discussions about what is required, right, to become an entrepreneur. And then the other extreme, right, so we have Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos, not just performing entrepreneurship in a very, I don't know, ridiculous way, but getting to the point where she committed investment fraud and now being prosecuted, right, facing up to 20 years in prison because of investment fraud, right? So they always wonder, well, is this what we want, right? Is this what we are pursuing, right? If that's the pinnacle, if that's what is kind of creating that massive difference in the world, is it the image of a hero, right? And if it's not, I mean, what do we do then? So with that idea, I think there are quite a few complications, right? So one to do with the odds, right? How likely is to get to that point, right? And I love this. I always show this to my MBA students, right? Because when you're dreaming of funding a unicorn, say, well, you know what? You're more likely to win an Oscar, right? To fund a unicorn, right? So you're more likely to do that, to win the lottery, or to find a four-leaf clover, right? Than to be able to get to that point, right? So even to get to a situation where you're ready to go public. So the chances of getting there are very, very minimal. I'm not saying that we shouldn't take risk. We should encourage people from engaging in entrepreneurial activity, but just need to be aware that the odds are against you, right? And in that, but nonetheless, we tend to promote entrepreneurship in a way that it's fairly irresponsible, right? Because we're not looking into that evidence, right? So what do we tell our students, or what do we tell the entrepreneurs that we've been, I don't know, incubated? Well, you have to dream big, right? Because if you dream big, it's likely that you'll be able to make it to the end of that journey, right? To the very top of that pyramid. But that creates a lot of issues, right? And there are things that sort of a double-edged sword, because there's things that would allow you to engage in entrepreneurial activity, but at the same time, they're very, very problematic, because it exacerbates the problems that comes with that reality I'm just describing. So one of the issues, for example, is overconfidence entrepreneurship. There's very common. You need that sort of extra little push, right? And confidence is a big part of it. But the problem is that entrepreneurs tend to overestimate their chances of success, right? So say, for example, that's a UK, that's an American study showing how 70% of the population believes that the chances actually of success are over the 80%, when in reality is that most businesses, 70% of the new businesses no longer exist after 5 years, right? So there's clearly a very unrealistic estimation of success in entrepreneurship to do with overconfidence. That leads to overestimation of individual performance. They tend to believe they're better than others, and that they tend to make incorrect assessment of the self, right? So the real capacities of the individual to, for example, make X amount of income. That creates a lot of activity, undoubtedly, right? So we have overconfident individuals that will start sort of pushing into the market. So it creates higher total activity and increase sort of the speed, right, to which entrepreneurs trying to enter markets, right? And the issue is that the entrepreneurial environments that we've created tend to exacerbate overconfidence, because what do we tell them? Dream big, right? And the issue is that the funds that we allocate, right, so that we give away, right, to support entrepreneurial activity, it's exacerbating that, right? So it creates a false impression that the running an innovative business is risk-free, but we try to like minimize the risk of engaging in activity, right? But that, again, that's an illusion, and entrepreneurship still is very problematic on that front, right? So it could be even more problematic than what we tend to think. Like another example, over optimism, right? So not just overconfident, but over optimism. And again, we believe that we need to be overly optimistic to be able to create a new business. But data, I mean, the evidence is not actually showing the opposite. You don't really need to. Then it leads to overinvestment, underestimation of risk, overestimation of expected returns. It happens that entrepreneurs tend to engage with entrepreneurial activities and tend to persist for a longer period of time. They should abandon, and they don't. And again, it affects exit rates. So things that we expect to achieve actually is creating exactly the opposite. And the issue is that there are clearly problems, right? So not surprisingly, we're seeing evidence coming up now showing how entrepreneurs exhibit a significantly higher higher depression rates than non-entrepreneurs. Another comparison studies were showing differences between like 30 and 15 depression, and the other situations, like for example attention disorders or bipolar disorders, that they act as preconditions, right? So they're good, and so people with attention disorders tend to engage in entrepreneurial activity much more, but it's also a consequence of it. Right, so it can exacerbate certain conditions. For example, again, attention disorders or bipolar disorder, addiction rates are higher, and unfortunately, suicide rates are higher as well. Right, so entrepreneurship, entrepreneurs themselves, they have a lot of what we call well-being resources, right? Mental health resources. So optimism, overconfidence, self-efficacy, and so on. But all of that sort of takes and puts them in a position, following perhaps this idea, in a very vulnerable position where they're exposed to risks, right? We have which is halfway through a study, participatory study looking at mental health in entrepreneurship, and we're seeing very clearly mismatch between expectations and experiences, right? So how self-determination is it's sort of they find themselves in a situation where they're unable, right, to get there, right, to find that the autonomy they're pursuing ends up in situations of isolation. That sense of achievement is made with the reality of not knowing whether they would be able to deliver, right? And that pursuit of meaning ends up with experience of sacrifice, right? So they feel guilty and ashamed because they're pursuing dreams, and everyone's, right, including the family, have to sacrifice themselves, right, for the sake of the entrepreneur's life purpose. So they all become impossible to meet expectations, and that tends to feed into a cycle of negative emotions, right? Shame, guilt, that trigger in pursuit of achievement, right? And again, this idea of achievement. But then we have the government and institutions, right, saying, well, we got you, don't worry, right? We will support you, and are trying to promote more entrepreneurial activity on the assumption that is good for everyone, right? But then the data, the evidence is telling us a different story. Is telling us that really you can do whatever you want, but the number of the startups, right, they correlate with the size of the economy, and the wealthier countries get, the rate of entrepreneurial activity starts to go down inevitably. So you can still promote more, but it's not gonna, the economy is been able to absorb more. Why in wealthier economies, they're high opportunity costs. Why would I? And in more deprived regions, what happens is that markets cannot absorb that amount of entrepreneurial activity, right? So the market is not mature enough. So it actually makes you wonder, well, where, how, and who actually engages in entrepreneurial activity, right? And what sort of industries. So you've kind of seen a slightly different picture, right? So in terms of value creation, job creation, for example, that's also been seen as a myth, where new firms, new businesses, they create a very kind of a very small fraction of employment and value added in the economy, right? So it's the vast majority. So you're looking at like 9% of business activity, but they create a very small fraction of value. All the data coming from the US and Sweden showing us that actually the gross new jobs that entrepreneurship create is less than 7%, net jobs less than 7% as well. And over the long run is when you will say, well, okay, those who survive, they will actually create jobs, but we're seeing that it's just 1.7%. And in some cases, we have evidence say, well, actually entrepreneurship destroys jobs, because they take jobs from the economy and under certain promises, but then they ventures disappear and that job is actually lost, right? And they're creating very unsecure labor conditions, right? It's not that good in that sense, right? And then you think about the amount of money we spend on new startups, right? The promotion of new startups, right? And you see the evidence, what it's telling us is that it takes 43 startup attempts, right, to create one job. So the ratio, right, entrepreneur to employee, it's not that promising. And over the long run, right, same thing, you can say, okay, those who survive, right, it's 43-9. So it takes 43 startup attempts to create 9 jobs, right, after 10 years. So it's not particularly promising. So if the number of firms in a country is correlated with the size of the economy, then policymakers can say, well, perhaps we can have a more significant impact on the type of enterprise instead of numbers. So don't go for numbers, let's go for value. And then there's the calls to focus on a subset of businesses, not every single business, right? And not any type of business, but those only with growth potential. That takes us back to the gazelles and the unicorns, and what our current prime minister at that time, when he was a chancellor, he called them viable businesses, with essentially businesses with growth potential. But we ended up in situations that are very, again, ridiculous situations, right? So this is, again, venture capital behind it, trying to fuel and trying to get businesses to certain valuation. And this is a story of a pizza owner selling through DoorDash, and he was able, given that venture capital money was subsidizing sales, he was able to buy his own pizzas for $24 for rebuy from 16 pieces have been sold for $24, right? So essentially, it's venture capital subsidizing an idea that it's sort of value that is not there. So the question is it really high growth? There is a really high growth potential here, right? In terms of economic value created, the answer clearly is no. It's just, in a lot of cases, thin air. So but then there's the other side. So okay, if it's not that, perhaps we can support entrepreneurship on the other side of the spectrum, right? So to try and help people in the private areas to overcome life circumstances, right? And this is a good 2019 paper looking into the effectiveness of policies to support entrepreneurship in poor areas. And what the evidence is showing actually is that it's not the case, because it's promoting since we haven't yet fixed the underlying feature of social exclusion, right, and the problems that they're coming with it. We end up with very precarious businesses in markets with very low entry barriers. So it's overpopulating a non-competitive or very kind of low competitive markets, and that's perpetuating the problem instead of fixing the problem. So at the macro level, we end up in the very same situation. We're promoting the very same situation we're trying to solve, and we're seeing that in a lot of places. I've been studying social entrepreneurship in Latin America, and it's exactly the same. We end up sending money. The government's not sending money where money is not needed, right? So because entrepreneurs were sort of educated enough to be able to put together a business plan, and those ones who get the money, and not the guys who actually need the funding. So there's a lot of paradoxes in how we operate, how we run entrepreneurship programs, and most of it comes from how we understand entrepreneurial activity. So a few colleagues, Frederica, she's been leading the conversation, right, in this call to decolonize, contextualize and decolonize entrepreneurship, right? Because ultimately it's about studying diversity, right? So that diversity, beautiful diversity that exists in the world, is being created by entrepreneurial activity, right? Again, along that very long tail of activity, and that kind of have to kind of take us to a position where we start reconsidering why, what, and the how of entrepreneurship. But we still, despite the calls, I mean, this has been ongoing for what, like, I don't know, 15 years now. We're still getting this sort of a comment backs when this is a comment we got back from a reviewer in one of our papers, right? That setting up a barbershop in Africa is not rocket science. So why should we care, right? And it's very it's, yeah, I don't know. It was shocking to us, right? So how, I mean, clearly it was a reviewer somewhere in the Western world, right, judging what might be happening in Africa and how difficult it is to set up a barbershop, right? If it takes 6 years, I mean, probably the guy is a stupid or something, right? It was shocking, right? Because maybe it's rocket science for that individual. Who knows? So we're just looking down on people, right? So most of what in Federica and Ted's view, most of what we built in terms of knowledge of entrepreneurship, it's been led by an idea, right? So it's who is normally men, where, industrialized countries, how it is mostly through innovation, and why, because they want to generate profit and wealth, and through that there will be sort of a value being sort of a cascading down and contributing to the society. And that means that we ended up with an idea of entrepreneurship that's very, very narrow. It tends to, we assume that it's stable, right? Because we're seeing, well, white men, industrialized countries producing that value. And we ended up saying, well, okay, that's it. That's entrepreneurship. Let's go and do something with research and promote practice and so on, right? Without kind of thinking too much about it. So the call is, well, why don't we pay attention to that perhaps is not so sexy, right, but long tail of entrepreneurial activity. And back in 2020, this started like 2011 with Jonathan thinking about it, and we wrote that paper, Entrepreneurship and the Rest, with the same idea, right? So entrepreneurship remains ethnocentric, narrow, and a lot of simplified assumptions about what the rest is, right? That very, very long tail is, and what we have in that paper is a call to imagining alternative futures, right? How entrepreneurship might look like, right? If it's a human, it's simply a human activity, right? It might occur in many possible different ways. So, and if that's the case, right, what are the hidden causes? So here's 3. I'm just gonna briefly mention. You can read the papers later, right? But just kind of take you through our thinking behind our intention to observe those alternative futures, right? That's Chile, which is actually easier. It's easier that way. And Chile is most of what happens is in the central region. North is desert, south is ice fields, right? So there's a lot of rural areas, isolated areas in the country. And this is from The Guardian. Entrepreneurial activity has been growing in the country for the last 20 years, and it's now being called a Silicon Valley, of course, with its own sex appeal, if you like, right? But the situation is different, right? Chile, we are still at the top of the inequality index, right, along with Mexico, right, leading the ranks, and with still multidimensional poverty levels fairly high. So it creates a distance between that sort of a fancy startup Chile worlds, right, that The Guardian is referring to, and the other reality, where it seems that there's nothing else but what you see on the left right hand side of the of your screen. And then if you go back to we're interested in places, so to literature on ecosystems, right? So this is the kind of the models that we currently have, and then not surprisingly, you start seeing network density, which is essentially in rural areas is impossible. Major universities, you have investment, capital markets, technology transfer, tech absorption, and all this sort of words that if you actually move those models into the rural areas, you ask, well, is there entrepreneurial activity? Because the assumption is that if you have that entrepreneurial activity, productive entrepreneurial activity will exist. The answer is probably no, it's impossible. But I've been studying, right? So I'm traveling around the areas, and this is from my sort of engagement with indigenous communities, and they do amazing work, right? And it's full of entrepreneurial activity, right? And very vibrant and combining things. So, I mean, it's there. So I got to the point where kind of very frustratingly say, well, either my experience was totally anecdotal, or what we currently do in research is creating, I mean, and the frameworks we create, the applicability is virtually null, right? So it's very limited what we can do with the current frameworks that we've produced and the knowledge that we've produced, because again, we've been sort of perhaps looking in the wrong places. So we got government funding back in 2015, and we did a fairly large study in peripheral and rural areas in the country, trying to figure out, okay, if it's not that, what is then? And we developed this. We published this paper in NERD, and then it evolved into a nicer figure that we're now trying with the National Centre for Rural Enterprise in the UK. We're trying to bring to the UK. But the model, what it reveals is a completely different picture, right? So if you start building from the ground up, what explains entrepreneurial activity in these places, right? So the conditions, the antecedents of it, they're very, very different. So where landscapes is put into value, rural capital is put into value, like the traditions, historical settings, cultural settings. So the things that matter that you wouldn't consider, right, in the traditional models, and simply because we haven't just pay attention to what actually exists in those places. So it gives a very kind of interesting understanding of rurality when you start building from the ground up, right? In another project, when we were interested in and this is still ongoing, we have to stop because of COVID, but we're back into it, right? We're interested in the idea of periphery, and how periphery, at least from the entrepreneurship literature, it comes with very negative connotations, right? Because it involves exclusion, marginalization, isolation, disconnection. So you're in the core, and then you're in the outskirts, right? So you're not part of the mainstream in that sense, right? So it's something that we have to fix, essentially, right? And how do we do it? By mimicking what's happening in the core, right? In the mainstream. So we end up sort of stigmatizing what happens in the periphery. So we were interested in knowing, right, so how communities in the periphery, they were using entrepreneurship, right, to overcome the circumstances, right? And we've been investigating 2 favelas in the south of Sao Paulo in Brazil. And interestingly, we found something completely different from what we're expecting to see, right? So because you're expecting to find, well, entrepreneurial activity contributing to growth and jobs and creating opportunities for people in the favelas. But we found something completely different that we call entrepreneurship as an act of resistance, right? So they were creating a culture of entrepreneurship, but not just for the sake of producing more startups, right? Productive startups, but they were constructing a slightly different imaginary of what living in the periphery is, right, and entails, and that's what they call this resistance from the periphery. And they were revaluing who they are, right? So instead of periphery being something negative, they have like an entire cultural movement and entrepreneurship as part of that mix, where they have like T-shirts, right? I am periphery. I am. There's a term called quebrada, which is broken. But it's also the cliff, right? So it's a dual meaning, and say, well, I am quebrada, I am broken, I am marginal. So they call it this contemporary revolution, the silent valley instead of the Silicon Valley, right? So they're developing their own meanings around it. And what is weird is entrepreneurship is part of this mix, right? So they're rebelling against things. They're met with certain situations, but they're grounding all of that in things that you wouldn't expect to find, right? So mixtures of sort of a cultural manifestation, but again, entrepreneurship is part of the mix. So it's a Black beauty movement, marginal literature, music, dance, religion, and it's all to do with being peripheral, being broken, being marginal, right? And trying to fight against things that they're seeing as negative, right? So they're seeing racism, negative crime, exclusion, phobia towards ethnic minorities and sexual minorities and so on, but they acknowledge the reality. So they're still living with gangs and trafficking and so on, right? And how they're using entrepreneurship to fuel that. And what we're calling here is we're using Taylor's work on social imaginaries to say, well, these guys, they're taking entrepreneurship as part of this mix to try and construct a new reality for them, where they're trying to reimagine what being in the periphery and what being periphery means, right? And what can they do with that? And they're catalyzing cultural emancipation, right? So it's a beautiful movement, but again, completely different from that idea of hero, right? This is simply to support cultural movement, right? And trying to reimagine who they are. And the last one, it's a view on prosperity. Not this is the Institute for Global Prosperity. You thought, well, yeah, maybe it makes sense to have a short sort of view on prosperity from our end, right? So this is a paper we published in JUE back in 2020, and it's to do with poverty and the dominant view of poverty and entrepreneurship, which is called the remedial view, right? And the remedial view is essentially about addressing resource scarcity, right? And it works something like that. So you, in poverty context, you plug in entrepreneurial resources, that being training, microfinance, and so on, that will create entrepreneurial activity in poverty context, and that would give people access to markets, right? And that's the creation of markets for the poor, what they call it. That would create income, leading to material improvements and life satisfaction, right? And essentially alleviation. And that's the formula. And we don't know that doesn't work. It hasn't worked for 20 years. And everything that we've done around aid programs through entrepreneurship, so using entrepreneurship as part of aid programs, they're not delivering any meaningful outcomes as expected. So we think that the problem is clearly an overemphasis on hedonic aspects of human development. So life satisfaction. You go and ask people, how do you feel today? And assuming that income is a key trigger of that. It clearly provides fairly inaccurate representations of life purpose, human achievement. So people in these settings are not supposed to dream, right? They're not supposed to do a lot of things that we are supposed to do. They have other needs to satisfy first, right? So we try to promote entrepreneurship as a way of creating income because that's urgent. but that relies on a fairly flawed assumption of how development works. And it starts sort of hiding away a lot of possible manifestations or ways of doing entrepreneurship that might be different from what we know and what we promote. Because there might be a lot of different paths that might exist beyond the remedial view, right? So people doing things in a very different way. And if you take other outcomes and other conditions into consideration. So what we did in our mind said, well, why don't we just keep that and think about broader life circumstances, right? What allows people to do things, and they have to act somehow in conjunction with entrepreneurial activity. And that was, instead of just staying today with life satisfaction, why don't we think about the future, right? And what we call prosperity expectations, so people thinking that the children will be able to prosper through the activities you're doing today. So what I'm doing today in my entrepreneurial activities makes sense in the future because there's someone in the future who will benefit from what I'm doing. And we feel that those expectations will create that those are important because that will shape, at least from a prospection point of view, that will create ideas of that future and that will have an impact on the decisions you make in the present, right? So we say, well, we need to take a theoretical turn if we want to be able, we want to do that. That's capable of holding together this is life purpose, prosperity expectations, and the broadest set of life circumstances in a manner that is not linear, right? So if you criticize on linearity, we should be able to take it differently. As you would expect, we ended up with Amartya Sen's work on conversion factors, leading to the construction of substantive freedom, right? So what allows people to do things. But we also had to rethink the outcome. If we're criticizing the overemphasis on hedonic aspects of human development, we need to think about hegemonic outcomes, right? And prosperity became one of them. And we're working with prospective prosperity and the idea of hope, right? As a goal-oriented action. And we were arguing that there's temporal interdependence, right? So as you're doing one, you're creating prosperity expectation that fits back into what you're doing today, right? So therefore, the effects are very cumulative in nature, right? The more you do, the more it fits back in, and you change the way you do things. So we're working as a project, as part of a project, comic relief project, studying entrepreneurs, farming entrepreneurs in Kenya. And we did like 3 years of data collection, trying to figure out like how changes in personal, social, and environmental circumstances were producing changes in future prosperity expectations. And not surprisingly, we found many varieties of entrepreneurial activities, right? So this is the same context as rural areas in near Nairobi, but entrepreneurs, in this case, farming entrepreneurs, they were exploiting those opportunities in many different ways, right? They're acting as everyday entrepreneurs, right? Exploiting real opportunities. So there's no new business creation. They're just finding ways around. And what we found is a very kind of interesting disconnect between entrepreneurship, life satisfaction, and financial improvements, right? So if you push the outcome into the future, right, to think about prosperity expectations, income, and life satisfaction, they're not that relevant, right? So in a lot of the cases, I mean, we run this is called qualitative, fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis, right? And it's showing you conditions enabling prosperity expectations, and what it's showing is that actually improvements in financial sort of changes in financial situation, right? So it's not conducive to entrepreneurial activity. So it means that it can decrease, but your prosperity expectation can increase at the same time, which is fairly intuitive. You assume, given the remedial view, that it can only improve if financial situation improves, right? And we show that it's not the case. But then we went and assessed the relationship between financial improvement and life satisfaction, and it's showing very clearly that relationship holds, right? So if you improve your financial situation today, your perception of your life satisfaction today changes. But if you ask people about prosperity, about kind of the future, the picture changes completely, right? So we found 3 types of entrepreneurial endeavors, and one of which, the individual market, what we call the individual market approach, is very consistent with the market inclusion approach, where with the remedial view, so input markets, monetization, and that leads to prosperity expectation. That's absolutely fine. But interestingly, that's the outlier. What we found is mostly family supported businesses, right? So they look inwards, and they try and just either by doing complementary activities, right? Or by just supporting through family activities, they try and that's how they achieve. So entrepreneurship can drop, or entrepreneurship can lead to diminishing like financial, so the income can decrease over time. But if the family is there, that means that prosperity expectations keep growing. It might be intuitive, right, at this stage, but showing with good data that in reality entrepreneurship does very little by itself, right? And when you move the outcome, the prosperity outcome into the future, it's fairly interesting, because that changes the way we frame entrepreneurship, the way we're supposed to support entrepreneurship, right? So if bringing just resources into it under the assumption that will create economic sort of income and then life satisfaction, well, if that formula doesn't work, what do we do then, right? So if you want to support entrepreneurship, perhaps we should be supporting something else, right? So we expand this remedial view. We show that this connection between life satisfaction, financial situation, and entrepreneurship when you factor in future prosperity expectations, right? In light of a broader set of life circumstances. So when entrepreneurship is seen as an income generated activity, it's actually it's not that relevant as we thought in the alleviation of poverty facing other life circumstances, right? So it's a fairly interesting view. So we feel that we need to seriously rethink, right? So if we are to grow as a field, right, so entrepreneurship, because we've done a lot in 20 years or so, it's a very new field. But what happens with maturity, so I would say our journals are now FT 50 journals, and so that sort of things. There's the competency trap, right? So we're so good that we just keep doing what we're doing, right? So and we feel that entrepreneurship should remain as a field of research entrepreneurial, because otherwise the risk of stagnation and losing what is special about the field is clearly at risk, right? So we need novel theories, we need real transformational research, right? We can have an impact on those realities that we care so deeply about. And that means that we need to drop a lot of the things that we've been doing, right? So clearly and intendedly, we're not judging intentions here, but there are power claims like the one I show you from that anonymous reviewer, and start embracing those other possibilities, right? And alternative capacities of how people can act and build their own realities in slightly different ways. To close, I'm going to close with 3 invitations. So I know that there are a lot of students and perhaps academics in the room, and if you're in a practitioner, there's something for you as well here, right? So in the Journal of Business Venturing Insights, we have a bunch of initiatives trying to open space for this sort of research, and also in a way that engages with practice robustly. So we have one special issue open, it's called Entrepreneurial Problems, Impacts, and Solution-Oriented Research, and the idea is to get a sense, I mean, because if we are to work in that reality, we need to get a sense of what the problems of that reality is, right? So instead of just insisting with explaining a fraction of the phenomenon, why don't we just go and expand and try and observe the problems behind it? And that we feel it will increase the chances of bringing our research closer to practice. The second one, it's a new section in the journal. It's edited by Rob and Reg, called Meaningful Heterodoxies. If the study of entrepreneurship is the study of diversity, it needs to be a diversity that matters, right? That's the idea of meaningful heterodoxies. Things like religion being one of them, right? So there are aspects in the world that matter and that we should be paying attention to. So not just diversity for the sake of it, it has to make sense. And the last one is something that is inspired the title of this presentation. This came out today. It's a call for fate papers and Journal of Management Studies called Recalibrating Entrepreneurship. We put it together with a few colleagues, and we're making invitations to recalibrate entrepreneurship in 3 areas. So one, to do with decolonization. So how can we move away from this dominance of Western theorizing, Western knowledge, and what sort of methods, theories, and voices can we bring in, right, to advance a better understanding. So how can we advance more authentic understanding of entrepreneurial activity? Second one is pluralism, which is about expanding the breadth of entrepreneurial activity. So there are many more, so we can kind of cast wider and finer nets to try and catch those diverse realities that we haven't yet discovered. And the other one is about everydayness, right? So that about going deep into that pluralism and trying to discover how do people do things, right? In the everyday, right? So the mundanity of it, right? And we feel that it will give us a very different view of that dominant view I was referring earlier in the presentation. So I'm going to close with that. I think I managed to get everything done on time. Well, obviously, if you have any questions, just go ahead. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, Pablo. Thank you. So let's start with a few thoughts. I think many of the people in the audience this afternoon would have been very taken aback, perhaps, by your critique of entrepreneurial activity, or entrepreneurs, indeed. I think many of them would think that entrepreneurs are solving some big world problems. But let me start first of all with a sort of quick and obvious question. So one of the myths, if you like, about entrepreneurship that you correctly deflated this evening is the idea that an entrepreneur is a particular kind of person. Yeah. So, I mean, do you think that's the case? Because if they're not exceptional individuals, then does that mean that we are all entrepreneurs as we try to get by in everyday life? And how would you how do you negotiate that position around that?
I think that the problem, and it comes from 60s, 70s, right, when psychology started to grow as a field, and influencing the rest of the fields, and we were part of it, right? So the origin of entrepreneurial research, entrepreneurship research, it's very grounded in psychology, right, in the cognition of entrepreneurship, until William Gardner came with the question, well, who is the entrepreneur, is the wrong question, because entrepreneurship is a process. So you are an entrepreneur as you're engaged in certain activities, then you're not an entrepreneur, essentially, right? So as you're creating a new business, there's a point when you stop doing certain things, right? You start pivoting. So you start pivoting and then you stop pivoting. At that point, you're a small business owner, right? And it's all about efficiencies, trying to get sort of the business I'm growing if you feel like it, like that's what you want to do, but you're no longer an entrepreneur. So that we're kind of we're still perpetuating the idea that people like the Elon Musks and the Brunsons and of the world, they're still entrepreneurs. They're not entrepreneurs, but they're not acting as an entrepreneur. They have a crazy personality that we then match with the idea of entrepreneurship, and reality they're not. So the issue is that because we're focusing on that mindset and the personality, we have a very misleading idea of what it means to be an entrepreneur, right? This is simply a process, a set of activities you do, and it's a lot. As long as you're doing that, you can call yourself an entrepreneur, right? Because you're engaged in those activities, and that gives kind of a open a space with the idea of entrepreneuring, which is the doing entrepreneurship, and that's a really interesting idea because it talks about life projects, right? And you're right, perhaps, to say that, well, as long as we engage in certain activities, you can perfectly so call yourself an entrepreneur. Why not? If that's what you're doing. So it's more defined by the action than by the personality of the individual.
Yeah, that's a very interesting perspective. And so there are sort of two kinds of entrepreneurs, particularly social entrepreneurs, that many people in this room might be interested in. So on the one hand, there are the people who are creating new businesses and, as you say, new forms of employment, although we take your point that they mostly don't do that. And then there are people who, through social entrepreneurship or through entrepreneurial activity, are trying to tackle the grand challenges of the day. So they're, in other words, they're developing new business models for example, the delivery of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Obviously, Mr. Musk is not doing, we understand that. But so how do you see that? I mean, what about those kind of businesses that have a social purpose? How do they fit into your analysis?
I mean, part of the narrative built around social entrepreneurs, it's very similar to what we're seeing. I mean, thinking that one social entrepreneur will be able to solve grand challenges, it's lunacy. It's not going to happen, right? And we meaning society generally, and policymakers more specifically, that throw money into that because there's hope, and naturally, right? Because these are hopeful endeavors.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean that they will do it, because social problems are complex. They're unable, right? We have bounded rationalities, they're unable to just get into those spaces and solve the problems, right? So I think I do that. I'm part of the board of social enterprises, and I do believe in that, right? So don't get me wrong. But we need to clean the space and be very honest and transparent of, okay, what is it that they do, what they can actually achieve, right? And I think that they're just part of I mean, today there's this sort of a plural society that Henry Mainsbury talks about, right? It's essentially civic society. It's who we are in our lives, and there are loads of those, right? And charity organization, volunteer organizations, right? Community interest companies, right? So many ways of kind of getting together to deal with sort of daily problems. Currently, social entrepreneurs, it's a new name for it, right? And it's just part of that. But thinking, that's the thing, right? So since we have the word entrepreneur in the mix, we feel that they can do a lot more than what a charity could do. But it's just another type of civil society organization, right?
Yeah. Yes. No, I think that's a very, very interesting perspective, because there is a sense that governments, in a way, have promulgated this idea that business is going to solve the world's problems, so that governments don't have to pay for it.
Exactly. Well, yeah, put it in a way, it's part of it. And what is problematic is, well, I do a lot of work with charities as well, and volunteer organizations, and there's the call to behave as a business.
Yes,
so
that's right.
So people think that, well, if I'm running a charity, perhaps I should become a social entrepreneur and start engaging in other type of activities, right? Income generating activities instead of charitable activities, right? And that creates a lot of complications, and in some cases, failure of the charitable sector is perhaps explained by that need to behave as a business, because that's supposed to be more professional, better, when in reality it might not.
Yes, it's quite interesting, because in many places in the global south, governments actually try to pressurize organizations who would formerly have been, say, non-governmental organizations into becoming sort of social enterprises, precisely because they can bring them within a different remit of control, including, of course, taxation of value and so on. And we had a very interesting discussion of tax right at the beginning of the autumn term, which I think many questioners might come back to talk about. But another part of this that interested me was something that I'm very concerned about in the work that I do, which is the idea that everyone who is poor has to be an entrepreneur. So there are many programs now about where companies want to reach the bottom of the pyramid, as it's called. And you find NGOs alongside those companies actually training people to be more entrepreneurial. So this is a very strange situation where people are encouraged to think that being entrepreneurial will allow you to be more active as an agent and solve all your life problems, right? I mean, what's your view about that?
I mean, the training we offer to this being entrepreneurial, it's just life skills, right?
Yeah.
So it's problem solving skills, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So you can benefit regardless of what you do with it. You can benefit from developing those skills. That's absolutely fine. The problem, I think, that generates is the expectation that comes with learning those skills.
Yeah.
If we expect that all of them will create a business, I don't think it's a fair thing it's not a fair ask, because you can use those skills in many different ways, right? And the issue, well, there are many issues that it's not just about that, right? So if you go to entrepreneurial recognition literature, you see traits, right? So all entrepreneurs share similar things, right? Confidence and self-efficacy and optimism. But it doesn't mean that by having that, you will become one. And that's a mistake. It's very dominant, right? So these are features that you tend to see in the entrepreneurial population, but it doesn't mean that by having that, you'll become one. So the same applies here, not just by having a certain set of skills, you will become an entrepreneur. So expecting that they all become entrepreneurs is very problematic, because it's likely that it's not going to be the outcome. And because there's another issue that economies cannot absorb that amount of activity, right? So so there's William Baldwin's paper about productive entrepreneurship, and he shows that actually the rates of entrepreneurial activity remain fairly stable over time, right? regardless, and it can go up to, I don't know, 20-22% of the general population engaged at any one point, but that's very, very high. So you can do whatever you want, and the numbers won't grow. It might grow artificially for a bit, but then the economy is unable to absorb that amount of entrepreneurial activity. And the more you try, so the wealthier the countries get, and the more you try, the more frustration, right, is the outcome, because essentially people in wealthier economies, there's a big opportunity cost there. So I would rather go and employ myself. I mean, entrepreneurial rates in the UK are currently, I think, even below 10%, right? So, and the same as in Europe. The only outliers is America, but for other reasons, right? So you can go to poverty, sort of to poor countries, if you like, in trying to promote entrepreneurial activity, but at least from the set expectations behind those programs, it's unlikely that they will be able to deliver what they expect to deliver. Yeah. But again, there's nothing wrong with that training, because it's life skills. Essentially.
But in this case, it's really, I think, governments looking at an alternative to formal employment. It's because formal employment levels are very, very low in many continents. And so entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial activity is meant to be a form of useful work, if you like, which stands in for formal employment. And this is hugely problematic and very, very prevalent in policy work in the global South. So I mean, if you've got 10 million young people coming onto the job market every year, and 80% of them are unemployed and going to remain unemployed as regards formal employment, then this myth that they could all be entrepreneurs is a quite convenient argument to be making to them, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean it's fine if you take it as a life projects, right? So the thing is the thing that we create expectations, right, of what's going to happen if you do that, right? Yeah. I think self-employment is great, and it's very fulfilling if you take it as a life project, right? But if you work with that, we have again participatory research with entrepreneurs, and in the back of their minds is, if you are an entrepreneur, you're supposed to do X and achieve Y, right? And you're supposed to grow and employ people. And in every program or any sort of a pot of money they go for, the expectation is that therefore the mindset, right, moves immediately in that direction, right? Because the KPI attached to the funding they go for, it's jobs. So they're supposed to grow. So it's fine if people want to this is again my view. It's fine if they want to engage in sort of to become sole traders, right, and self-employed. Just that there's no need to ask them to do more than that, right? Self-fulfilling as is. No need to do more, really, and that's entrepreneurial activity, anyways. That's the whole point, and it's part of that diversity I was just referring to.
No, well, I think the point made about pluralism, diversity, decolonization is very, very well made, and I think people want to pick that up. Thank you, Pablo, very much. Hope to see you in the IGP in person. I'm trying to look at the camera to remember not at you.
Next time, absolutely.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye now.